Okay, good afternoon everybody and welcome to our latest Lunchtime Live. I'm Rob from Zero Waste Leeds and today I'm joined by Dr Mark Sumner from the School of Design at Leeds University. Welcome Mark, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for giving us the time to take part.
Yeah, no, thank you. So just to set a bit of context, so hopefully a lot of you will know that we've been focusing on clothing during COP26 because it's one area that we think is really interesting to look at the kind of climate impacts of clothing, and it's something that it's estimated that somewhere between 4 and 10%, I think, of carbon emissions come from the kind of clothing supply chain. But that's something that we can explore a little bit more with Mark. But quite a bit of the work we've been doing over the last 10 days has been informed by some of the research that Mark has done at the University of Leeds, informed by some of his previous work. So we thought it'd be really interesting to explore some of those things in a bit more detail. So it is live today. We'll do our best to respond to any comments, pop up any comments in Facebook, and we'll try to either respond to them during the conversation, or we'll get a response to you after the conversation. Would you mind just giving us a little bit of kind of background to what you did before you were at Leeds University and your areas of research that you're looking at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked in the retail fashion industry for over 15 years. And for a large proportion of that time was engaged in understanding where our clothes came from, how they were manufactured. And that was all driven by trying to make sure that the product was, a good quality product, good value, etc. But as time went on, the company I was working for wanted to focus more and more on sustainability. So I then spent, I think, something like 6 years really just focusing on behalf of the business on the sustainability of our clothing and the role that fashion plays within society and industry. And just before I left industry to work in academia, well, one of the reasons I left the industry was I couldn't understand consumer behaviour around sustainability. And it was this idea that we were getting all of these messages saying consumers want to be green. And we were developing all of these products that were what we absolutely knew scientifically were better for the environment. But they weren't selling, and we weren't getting any connection with our consumers. So I decided to leave the working environment, let's say working environment, leave the industry environment, and then come to the University of Leeds to really understand a bit more about the consumer psychology about how and why we buy stuff, the consumer psychology around sustainability, to then be able to understand how we actually align what happens in industry with what consumers are wanting from their clothing. So I've been doing that now for the past 8 years. So I focus very much on understanding some of the engineering, some of the science behind fashion and the supply chain and the impacts, but also understanding that interaction between us as individuals with our clothes and how those two things come together to set us challenges for sustainability and how we minimise some of the impacts that our purchases have.
Yeah, interesting. So hopefully that's something we can explore over the next 20 minutes, both, as you say, the kind of big kind of clothing industry kind of questions, but also, as you say, our kind of individual, the psychology behind why we, why we buy. I mean, could we start first of all by looking a bit at I suppose the kind of complexity of clothing as an industry or a system, whatever we want to call it. And obviously, because of COP26, we've been focusing on the kind of climate impact of clothing. Could you give us a bit of an overview of where in the clothing supply chain the main kind of impacts are?
Yeah, no, and it's always really interesting when people talk about the fashion industry. We more and more are talking about fashion being an industry of industries. To deliver that garment from the drawing that the designer creates at the very start of the process and get that delivered as a finished article to you as the consumer for you to wear it. It's been estimated something like 290 different stages of that process. But to simplify that down, essentially what we're doing in terms of fashion is we're sourcing raw materials either from an agricultural system, whether that's for cotton or for wool or for cashmere or even feather and down from ducks and geese, or we're sourcing raw materials from non-renewables such as oil, so making polyester and nylon, for example. And then we have a whole process of stages and manufacturing processes that convert that raw material into the garment. Key hotspots for us, so in terms of climate change and general sustainability, materials, by far, almost 40% of the carbon footprint associated with a garment is related to the carbon footprint of either extracting or growing or processing those raw materials ready for the manufacturing process. And then within the manufacturing process itself, that conversion process of taking that fibre and turning it into a garment. So we have to take the fibre, we need to spin it into a yarn. We then need to create a fabric, either knit it or weave it. And then we have to apply colour. And obviously colour is a really important part for fashion, as we know. And those three processes are very, very energy intensive. Lots of electricity used to drive the spinning equipment, lots of energy to drive the knitting and weaving machines. We also have a lot of energy in the dyeing process, because this is a high temperature process. So we're heating water up to 80 or 90 degrees. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of tons of water being heated up to do this dyeing process. So we have a really big impact there. Not as big as the material impact, but a big impact. Surprising, I guess, for a lot of people, is we also have a very large carbon footprint associated with the consumer. So up to 20% of the carbon footprint associated with clothing is down to what we as consumers do with those clothes in terms of washing them, drying them and ironing them. And interesting, well, I always find this really interesting, is people talk about locally sourced. Now, locally sourced can be really important for some sectors, but for the fashion industry, shipping a garment in a container on a boat from China, 6 weeks on the water to have it delivered into the UK, the carbon footprint of that is so low relative to all the other carbon footprint components. We don't even look at it. It's so small. It's not really focusing on. So sometimes locally sourced isn't always the best way of reducing our carbon footprint. So what we've got there is those hotspots, materials, that manufacturing process, and then what we do with those clothes in our own homes.
Interesting, and we'll share that you helped us put together a pie chart which showed those main impacts. And as you say, each of those in terms of materials, whether it's kind of crops that are growing or materials that are manufactured, that was around about a third of the impact, I think, and a similar kind of number in terms of then kind of turning those materials into garments. As you say, dyeing is something that I found really interesting. That was really kind of energy intensive. And then I think it was around 20% is actually us as consumers washing, drying, ironing our clothes. So again, that's one where we can have quite a kind of impact. So as I said, we'll share some more information in the kind of comments, but I'm kind of interested, before we get into the detail of what we can do, to just understand a little bit more about your interest in the kind of psychology of this. Because one thing that you wrote a blog, which again we'll kind of share, which for COP26, where it was something that challenged me actually, where you said I think you said something like, I don't think stopping people buying fashion is the answer. And I'm kind of interested to understand, what's your understanding of the reasons we buy, and why you think actually just saying don't buy may not work.
Yeah, and I think Rob, it's about understanding the function of fashion. I think for a lot of commentators who don't understand the function of fashion, and I'll clarify what I mean by that in a second. For a lot of commentators, they think that fashion is facile. It's something that we just want to engage in because it's fun, it's frivolous, it doesn't have any intrinsic value. And from that context, when we talk about the fashion industry being somewhere between 4 or 10% of global impact in terms of carbon, people will argue and say, well, it can't be right that we have such a frivolous activity such as fashion having such a big impact. But there's important points to build around that. For example, everyone on the planet engages in fashion in one form or another. Now, and I use fashion in the widest context. So we're talking about people wearing clothes. It's very, very, very rare to find any human being not wearing clothes. So the fact that we've got almost 8 billion people on the planet, every single one of them engaged in fashion of some form, means we're going to have a considerable footprint. It's like saying, being surprised that the food industry has a big footprint. Of course it does, because it's providing food for everyone on the planet. Now, that's not a defense for fashion. But when we start thinking about this function of fashion, that point you were sort of alluding to, is fashion isn't just in fact, in modern cases, is not about keeping us warm. It's not about keeping us dry. Fashion is actually much more intrinsic in terms of our psychology. And we can go back thousands of years, pre-industrial era, pre-fast fashion. Fashion plays a really important role in terms of self-identity. We talk about ourselves with the clothes that we wear. Fashion also is about self-esteem. We can feel good by having clothes that make us look good. Fashion is about identifying our status, and and that's been more and more documented now, that status setting, not just by fashion, by the way, but by our possessions, which is why consumption is so high now. Consumption of all sorts of things, because in many ways consumption is a clear indicator of our status, or the status that we want to project. So what we know about fashion in terms of its function is that fashion is the most powerful non-verbal communication device that we use to interact with other people in society. So that's the function of fashion. So from that perspective, saying to people you cannot communicate with others because you can't buy clothes, although that might be a noble intent to reduce our carbon footprint, goes against the psychology that we as humans have. So what we need to understand is how we can deliver the function of fashion without all of the inherent consequences that we have of the conventional business models. And what we need to be looking at here is changing those business models, trying to find a better way to reduce our footprint. Now, I'm not suggesting, by the way, that we carry on consuming as we are now. There are lots of things that we can do to reduce our consumption, but this idea of just saying stop buying clothes is a really difficult concept. And I should just add, by the way, that we've just finished a research project looking at the impact of COVID on the supply chain. And when we all stopped buying clothes in March of last year, so basically there was a really big drop off in terms of purchasing of clothing. The implications for that for the supply chain were immense. People lost their jobs, people were unemployed. And when they were unemployed, they didn't have any social security to protect them, or any furloughing to protect them, as we did in the UK. So we had hundreds, thousands, even millions of people reliant on fashion, suddenly having no orders, no jobs. And I know that's a very artificial way of saying stop buying, and it's a very unique position, but it does demonstrate how connected our consumption is with the production, and our responsibility in terms of how we manage that.
No, that's really interesting, and I think it's something we'd be keen to keep exploring over the coming weeks and months, really, because it is, as I say, as zero waste leads, that message challenges us a little bit. Do you know what I mean? In terms of how we do engage people, because we are thinking that there is something about trying to reduce the amount of consumption in the first place, whether that's clothing or whatever it might be. But I can totally understand that there is, particularly around the kind of psychology of this. I think there's things to explore. And also, I mean, it's something that we're keen to explore. It's not just a question of kind of younger people, but clearly younger people are a particular, kind of a key audience in terms of buying fast fashion. And just to put a little plug in for something we did last week, we had an Instagram live chat that Francesca, a recent graduate who joined us, kind of did with a few young people, looking at clothing from a kind of younger person's kind of context. I think it's something that we'd be keen to kind of explore in more detail, to understand how you then work with people to hopefully make some kind of changes. But I'm conscious of time, just to, I suppose, because what's interesting is there is such complexity that you've kind of pointed us to, and almost the kind of psychology, and us as citizens and consumers almost kind of adds to that complexity, but I'm also interested to see what are the things we can do. Do you know? Because sometimes when we see that complexity, we think, oh, there's nothing I can do, and I feel like that's something we don't want to be in. So I kind of want to explore what are the things that you think people can do, and again, you kind of helped us a bit to kind of put together a few kind of themes that we explored during the week. And one of the themes was about, we talked about buying better, and again we thought a little bit about, you know, what's the best way to express that. But could you give us a few ideas on, if people do, you know, want to buy better and have fewer environmental impacts, what are the kind of things people need to be thinking about?
Good question, Rob. And I have to say, you know, having worked in the industry, I think it's now close on 30 years. I find it difficult to know, you know, the right product to buy, because it is so complex. And you know, what the industry should be working hard at. One of the things the industry should be working hard at is trying to reduce that complexity, because it's really challenging for fashion, trying to work out what's the right thing to do. And many of the people I still work with in the industry, you know, scratch their head and go, well, I could do this, but when I do this, this happens, and then this happens, and you get some unintended consequences. But I think from a consumer perspective, we need to start to move away from feeling a level of guilt, particularly for younger people who are creating their self-identity and their self-esteem through their purchasing. But what we need to be thinking about is how we can buy better. And what I mean by that is, it's not specifically this idea of buying better clothing, you know, that maybe, you know, people might think is more durable or more stylish, or you know, whatever definition we're talking about there. But the actual process of buying, that we are better at buying. And there's a couple of things that we can be thinking about there. We could do a bit of research, and all of us can do this. There's so much information on the web that we can do to have a look at what your favourite brands are doing around sustainability. Are they talking about any targets that are set? And of course, we've got COP26 with government pressurising people to make targets. We do the same thing with business. And in fact, businesses are much more transparent about some of the targets they're setting in government, but that's another story. But we can do that research, and we can look at our favourite brands and say, are they setting targets? Are they part of voluntary initiatives? Things like Textiles 2030 in the UK, which is aiming to reduce the carbon footprint of clothing by 50%. Are they part of the Ethical Trade Initiative that looks at human rights and worker rights within the supply chain? And if you can't find any information about a brand on their website, and they're not talking about any targets, not talking about any initiatives, they're not demonstrating which garments are using sustainable raw materials, then we have to challenge those brands. We have to start off by saying, well, if you're not telling me whether they're sustainable, I'm going to make the assumption that they're not sustainable. I have this idea that maybe we then think about which brands we're buying from. So buying from better brands in terms of their sustainability. And you know, if there is a brand that, you know, that you really engage with, you know, that really does all the right things in terms of, you know, the fashion that you want, but they're not doing anything, think about writing to the chief executive. Think about writing to their head of sustainability if they've got one. And it takes 5 minutes.
And do you think that kind of thing, do you think they take notice of that kind of thing? If I were to write to them, will they tend to get to the CEO or whoever it is?
Well, I'm not sure if I should go on record and say this, but when I worked in the industry, we had a customer service team that all of this information came into, and it got sort of chewed over and managed by the customer service team. But letters that were specifically addressed to the chief executive tended to get through to the chief executive. And when they got through to the chief executive, more often than not, it got sent down the chain of get this sorted. So, you know, it's about perseverance. It's about, you know, writing to the right people, or writing to all of the directors. You could even think about, and this is from a business point of view, is becoming really interesting now, is the people who fund businesses, the investors. You know, you might even think about, you know, and that's a more difficult one to make the connections, but we are seeing investors putting pressure on brands as well. So that won't get you an immediate response, but if enough people do it, then things start to change.
No, interesting. Well, I mean, we'd be really keen to hear from our followers if people have done that kind of thing. I mean, one thing I did as part of this campaign was I did a bit of a wardrobe audit. I had about 150 items of clothing. I looked at the 3 main brands that I bought from, and I've been in touch on social media. I had a response from one, but not from the other 2, but did a bit of research on them. But yeah, I think, well, my action from here will be to maybe take it up a level and see if I can get a response from the, someone a bit higher up. But I suppose this is interesting in the context of what you talked about where the impacts are in the clothing supply chain, in that we'll come on in a moment to some of the things, some of the personal choices we can perhaps kind of take, but it's kind of acknowledging that actually the big impacts are, they are actions by, kind of the businesses who are, wanting these crops to be growing or manufacturing the products. And so if we can influence them, that is where we can have some kind of real big kind of impact. So
absolutely, and I think with some of these brands, there's a perception that big business doesn't care, and actually some of the big businesses do care, and they need that nudge, they need that confidence to drive for them to take that big step forward. As I said, when I was working in the industry, we were doing lots of really good green initiatives, but we weren't getting customers engaged in it. Now that's sort of 10 years ago. Things have changed a lot. So yeah, there's definitely something that can be done around the brands that we're buying from, but also in terms of that process of buying stuff, having and again, it's difficult from the psychology point of view, but trying to move away from that impulse purchase. Trying to move to a more considered approach, saying, will I actually use this? Because I'm sure we all have in our wardrobe that garment that we bought and thought, that's a brilliant garment, got it home or had it delivered, and then went, no, I'm not, and you've worn it 2, 3, 4 times and it's sat in the wardrobe. So better buying is about saying, being more careful with that selection process in terms of,
I think that's definitely a good message. It's one we've explored over the past week. And again, we're conscious not everybody will necessarily be wanting to buy from vintage and charity shops all the time. But that is one good example of one thing that you can do to in terms of lowering the kind of impact of your own kind of clothing. But I think that thing of being more thoughtful and thinking, is this something that we've talked about, will I wear this 30 times? Is it something that I've got other things in my wardrobe that I can wear with it? These are all things that I think can make some kind of impact. And then obviously we've mentioned, we had a chat on Friday with Leeds Community Clothing Exchange about, again, kind of swapping clothes. I think is certainly another area that is worth looking at, and thinking, as you say, just a slightly different way of thinking how you can get the clothes that you want. And I suppose also what I'm interested in there is how, for at least some of us, that can also be an expression of our identity that we are happy to share with other people, that we do buy secondhand, or we do go to clothes swaps, and that for a lot of us can actually be something that we're quite happy to project as something to other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right, and the size of that market is currently really quite small, but is growing. I'm seeing more and more people engaging in it, and there's really lots of positives associated with secondhand clothing, because the longer we can keep a garment being used, whether it's with you or whether it's with someone else, the longer that garment is being used, the lower its overall carbon footprint is relatively in terms of its production. So going back to that example, we've all bought a garment and we've worn it 2 or 3 times and just went, actually, it's not for me. If we know that we're not going to wear that garment, and sometimes there's a big if, because that's also one of the challenges, that we always think, well, I might wear it for an occasion. But if we really know that actually we're not going to wear that again, having it sitting in the back of a wardrobe, not being used, in some ways is far worse than going out and buying another garment. Because all of the resources that were used to make that garment, all of the human hours involved in growing the cotton, weaving it and making the garment are wasted. It's sitting in that wardrobe. So what we should be thinking about doing, and again, this is stuff that we can do ourselves, is as consumers, is say, well, I need to declutter my wardrobe. Not to make space for new stuff, per se, but to say, well, I don't wear it anymore. I'm not using it. Someone else can get the benefit of that. So we can either give it to charity, and lots of charities, as we know from the pandemic, suffered really badly because they couldn't get old clothes. They make a lot of money from old clothes for good causes. So there's giving it to charity. Or we might decide that, we want to sell it through, those peer-to-peer. And
as you say, that is a market that's expanding, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot, we see a lot more adverts for the online marketplaces and things. So, So even if we, as individuals, decide that we don't want to buy secondhand clothing, and there's lots of reasons why secondhand clothing is quite difficult for a lot of people, you can actually be putting stuff into the market for other people to buy. I think that's a really good point. And again, that's something I took out of kind of reading your research, in that when you see where the climate impacts are in terms of, growing the crops, manufacturing the materials, and making the clothes, the very least we can do is do what we can to try to keep that clothing in use as long as possible. And as you say, I mean, I can totally recommend the kind of wardrobe, because I got rid of about 50, 60 items of clothing that I just wasn't going to, they're no good to me anymore, but perfectly good items of clothing. So, and again, keeping those things in use for longer, hopefully there'll be somebody, I'm sure there'll be somebody else who will, that those clothes will fit them in the way that they don't fit me.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, one of the challenges that we have with clothing is lots of people go, well, will someone want to wear this? It might look a bit tired, or it's no longer fashionable. Don't worry about that. I mean, if you are concerned that you don't think someone's going to wear it because it's not fashionable anymore, if you give it to a charity, they will find someone that can do something. And even if they can't find a market for it as a garment, most of these charities are really effective in finding alternative uses. So they might actually chop the garment up into rags for use as rags to be sold to engineering companies, for example. Or ultimately they'll get shredded and turned into materials that are used for filling or for insulation.
And again, it's interesting in West Yorkshire, isn't it? Because I mean, there's a long history of that kind of shoddy and recycling and all that kind of thing. And as you say, it's much better if we can reuse, but there are options in terms of recycling of material, if all else.
I mean, the very worst thing that you can do with any textiles is throw it in the bin. Once it goes in the bin, it's completely useless for anything. If it gets water on it, food stuff, if it gets damp, soiled, it literally has no use at all. So the bin should be the last option. Now, I do throw textiles into the bin. The rags that I use for cleaning my bike, for example, I know there's no use for those. So it is about making that judgment call. But I guess before we get to the bin, and we're thinking about what else people can do in terms of their footprint, we talked about 20% of the carbon footprint is associated with what we as consumers do. And a big chunk of that is going to be down to how often we wash our clothes. Do we line dry or do we tumble dry? Ironing the clothes. So those three things contribute to that carbon footprint. And what's really interesting, whether you're, green or not, it's absolutely clear. If you reduce the amount of washing you do with your clothes, if you reduce the amount, if you line dry rather than tumble dry, and if you, I can't remember the last time I picked up an iron, but I think that's probably a COVID thing.
Just looking at myself, I thought, maybe I should have ironed it today. But maybe I'm doing the right thing.
Exactly, yeah. So, but the consequences of that is you're going to save some money, particularly with energy costs as they are at the moment. But you're also going to be reducing water use in your washing machines. Potentially, you're going to be reducing microfibers that are created in the washing machine that then go down the drain. And we're doing some research on that at the moment to try and understand the scale of that type of pollution. But importantly, which isn't talked about an awful lot, is the very worst thing that we can do to any garment in terms of its durability, in terms of its longevity, it's not about wearing it, it's actually washing it. Washing is quite an aggressive process. It causes garments to shrink, it causes colour loss, it can cause pilling, and it's quite an abrasive process in a washing machine. So we're reducing the life of the garment. So the fact that and I think all of us will recognise, well, all of us that sort of do our own washing, that it's so convenient, it's so easy to wash clothes now compared to what it was years ago. And as a result, we tend to wash clothes much more than we used to do. And actually, we don't need to wash garments as much as we think. If something isn't doesn't quite smell as fresh, stick it on the line in the sun, and the sun will reinvigorate that garment without having to wash it. Now, of course, I'm very aware of the fact that not everyone has got gardens and washing lines and what have you, so that can be quite difficult. But this idea of washing clothes, we don't need to wash them as much as we do. And we can save money by reducing our washing, and we're extending the life of the garment. So there's a really interesting thing that we can do in terms of managing.
And we've shared some kind of ideas on that throughout the week, but we'll do some more later this week. Again, I think that just to reiterate, estimate of 20% of the kind of climate impact of clothing coming from how we look after our clothes ourselves. So it's not insignificant. Do you know what I mean? In terms of the difference we can make in terms of maybe washing a bit less, lower temperatures, not ironing as much as we may have done in the past, and drying as well. So I'm conscious of your time, and this is something. I mean, clothing fascinates us because it is quite a complex issue. Do you know what I mean? And I think I clearly can't cover everything in 40 minutes, but hopefully we've helped to give people a bit of an overview of the clothing system as a whole and where the main kind of impacts are. And I'll ask you in a minute, I know this might be quite difficult, but if there are 2 or 3 things you think people should go away with to kind of think about themselves, we could think about. But just to kind of summarize myself a little bit, I mean, hopefully what we've helped people to do is to kind of understand where the main impacts are, and you've talked about, again, we've shared the pie chart in the comments, but around a third from the materials themselves, whether they're grown or manufactured, around a third from the kind of the process of making the clothes, and then around 20% in terms of us looking after how we look after the clothes. They're the kind of big impacts. There are other impacts as well. So you've talked about the fact that those big impacts in terms of growing and manufacturing, maybe one thing we can do is to use our influence a little bit. So we can tell the businesses that we buy from that actually this matters to us and we'd like you to do more about it, reduce those impacts. I think that's something that we can all do, and we'll kind of push later this kind of week. But I think there are also things we can do. You've helped us to understand that there is a, part of the complexity is our psychology around why we buy clothes, and I think we need to understand that better. But there are things we can do in terms of perhaps making slightly more informed choices about how we buy our clothes as well. So that's something we can do. So as I say, we'll share a lot more of that kind of in the comments and over the next few days. But it may be too difficult to try to get people to focus on 2 or 3 things to think about. But can you think in terms of what people may, if they're interested in this, what are the things that you think it'd be good to kind of go away from this conversation thinking about more?
I think that there's a lot of complexity in the industry, and as a result of that, we tend to hear the same myths being projected, which in many cases are myths. So, for example, cheap clothes are less durable, lower quality than expensive clothes, and it's a very broad generalisation. But we did a piece of work a couple of years ago where we looked at the durability, the quality of denim jeans, and the price range was from £13.50 up to £180. What we found by testing, so we've got a very extensive testing lab here at Leeds, and we tested garments in terms of abrasion performance, in terms of shrinkage, in terms of all of the key things that cause a garment to fall apart, essentially. It's no longer usable. The £13.50 jeans performed 2.5 times better than the 180 pair of jeans. What does that mean? What it means is you would have to buy that 180 pair of jeans, you have to buy 2.5 pairs to get the same performance from one pair that were £13.50. Now, I'm not saying that all garments that are at that lower value, that lower price point, are better than the higher price point. But what I'm saying is there's a myth there that, you know, cheap means poor quality and less durable. The other thing about that as well is another myth is that, you know, fast fashion brands are doing everything wrong and luxury brands are doing everything right. And again, when you look at the research, when you look at what these brands are committing to do, and actually not just committing, what they're actually publishing in terms of their progress, we can see that a lot of the fast fashion brands and a lot of the mid-market brands, you know, Next and M&S and the like, are making some fantastic progress relative to some of those designer labels and some of those luxury brands. In fact, you know, that group are driving the momentum forward. So if you look at the membership of Textiles 2030, for example, which is the UK fashion industry drive for sustainability, what we'll see there is surprisingly, there'll be some brands in there that historically have had a bit of a bad reputation, and rightly so. But what they're doing now is moving the bar and challenging themselves to do things better. So, and this is why I say, you know, it's really complex to know what the right thing to do. And that's why we need to do some research. You know, when you're looking at your brand, explore what they're saying on their website, explore what other people are writing about them in terms of their performance. Avoid the sensationalism and actually trying to get down to the science. Because what we need to do, and this is going back to why I left the industry in the first place. You know, I talked about this idea that I just couldn't understand consumers. And one of the consequences of the fact that we're doing all this green stuff but no one was buying it meant that we invested less and less in terms of doing environmental and social programs, because it just appeared that we weren't connecting. So we need to provide business with challenges, but also with the confidence to know if they do the right thing, that we will stay loyal to them and you know, still engage with them. So it's part of that symbiotic relationship that happens between brands and their consumers. And of course, what we're now seeing as well is more and more brands are saying, we recognise that, you know, we're selling too much, and we want to work with our consumers to see how we can give them what they want, but without selling too much of it. So there's some really exciting, challenging things that are going on in the industry. And what we need is people to engage in that, both from a consumer point of view, but and also from the industry side as well.
Because so I think that's it. I think with there are ideas that we've explored in terms of our own personal choices around kind of clothing, but I think one of the key things I'm taking from this conversation is our role as influencers, to use a kind of fashion term, but influencers as in influencing the industry. Do you know what I mean? We've to try to get them and governments to kind of be doing more, so the big things in the kind of fashion and clothing supply chain kind of change, as well as each of us maybe thinking a bit more about, you know, how we buy or swap or share or whatever it might be. So Mark, I'm conscious we could go on for some time, but I think we've taken up more of your time than we expected. So could I just thank you for joining us this afternoon, and you know, and also thank you for your input into the campaign. Really, it's really helped us to kind of think a bit more about how we could get some of these messages across. And we're conscious there's loads more for us to talk about than we could ever talk about in a 2-week campaign, but hopefully we can do more, and hopefully more with the University of Leeds as well. So thank you for today, and thank you to everybody kind of watching. If we've got things in the comments, we'll add some more. If there's questions we haven't got to, we'll do our best to answer kind of them. And please keep an eye out over the next few days. We're continuing to look at these various themes around the kind of climate impacts of our clothing choices. And if there are things that you think we're not covering that you think that we should, please, you know, stick that in the comments, and we'll do our best to do that. So Mark, thank you very much again, and thanks everybody for watching. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.